Good evening, everyone. My name is John Taves, and I'm the event coordinator here at McNally Robinson Booksellers. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that McNally Robinson is located on Treaty 1 territory, the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. In addition, McNally Robinson Booksellers itself rests on the land once occupied by the Métis community of Roostertown. We're so delighted that all you folks could join us here live in the atrium and of course live on YouTube now or in the future for the launch of Chris Rutkowski's Canada's UFOs, Declassified, which is published by August 9th Press. I am the least interesting person who will be speaking here tonight, so I'll get my portion of the evening over pretty quickly. I just have a few procedural notes for you right now. So the evening will proceed with some comments and a conversation with the gentleman to my left. Following that, there'll be an opportunity for you to ask questions. Now, just to ensure that everybody watching at home can hear the questions, I'll be wandering around with my microphone and asking you to ask me the questions. I'll then repeat them, as it'll be impossible for me to do justice to the eloquence of your questions. So I'll just ask that you please keep them fairly succinct. Just rest assured you will have ample time to talk to Chris and further interrogate him when you get to the signing line after the event. If you're watching on YouTube, you can ask questions as well. You'll notice there's a live chat going. So just write them in the chat and we'll get to them as time permits. Following the event itself, we'll just ask you to remain in place for one moment while we safely transport Chris to the signing table. At that point, you all will be able to descend and get your book signed. But I'll have more exciting details about book purchase and signing procedure after that, so stay tuned. Right now, we are here to find out what Chris found out about Canadian government UFO investigations. We're joined by host Winnipeg City Council Candidate, event host and former radio personality Hal Anderson of CJOB and Global News. And we'll be hearing a statement from a particular MP that Chris will share with, or Chris and Hal will share with us momentarily. Now, Winnipeg science writer Chris Rutkowski, whom some of you may be familiar with, has poured through official documents and found amazing details of UFOs seen by average Canadians, but also by pilots, RCMP, and military personnel. Many of these documents were previously classified, some made available by Library and Archives Canada and through access to information requests. We're here to hear a little bit more about that. So please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Chris Rutkowski and your host, Hal Anderson.
Thank you very much for being here tonight. I'm glad you got it right. I'm not on the radio and I'm not writing newspaper columns these days. I am running for city council. If I win, I'll do that. If I lose, I'll be back on the radio and writing columns again. So it's sort of a win-win, but I hope I win. Let me just start by saying, and this is Chris's night, and I'm so excited, his 10th book, he's a bit of a slacker. He wrote his first book 30 years ago, so that's one every 3 years. I don't have a book in me, so he's doing one every 3 years. He's done 10, so that's truly amazing. I'll tell you about my relationship with Chris and why I'm excited to be here. And the only part that I'm disappointed in is that I wasn't able to write about him in the book in my Sun column and on CJOB. I could not interview him today, but Kathy Kennedy today did a great job talking to him. I was a young boy in southern Alberta. It's not a long story. I know it sounds like it's going to be. And I had a fascination with UFOs, or as we now know them, I have to always check, UAP, right? And I remember my dad helping me to build a UFO detector. And I don't know if it was in a comic book or what it was, and it involved wires and tinfoil, not on my head. But it involved wires, and it was to wake you up in the middle of the night if a UFO was over your head or whatever. And so I've always had an interest in them. And then to come to Winnipeg in '89 in my mid-20s and get to know Chris, and then have Chris for many times on my show to talk UFOs, and Chris will often get text messages, you know, in the middle of the night about something I've read or heard, and Chris has always been great about answering those text messages. And he's done a great job on my show. And then he has also done a phenomenal job of approaching this, I think, as a science writer. He's a science writer and a weirdologist. So I think that's key. That really is key. So I'll turn it over to Chris. I'm excited to be here tonight. I'm glad you're all here because I want to hear from Chris about this new book. And Chris, I know you want to start with some thank yous before I read a really cool letter that you got.
Yeah, thank you very much, Hal. And I'd like to say, first of all, thank you so much for taking time out of your very busy schedule these days to come and host this.
Happy to be here.
So I do have some thank yous, and I have to, first of all, thank McNally for hosting this book launch. Almost all of those 10 books, I think, were launched here. And so they've been very gracious. I think my face is still above the cash register, which is good to hear. I haven't taken it down yet. And thank you very much to John Taves for facilitating this. I'd like to thank other people who have had a big part in me producing this book. And before I get to that, I just want to say thank you so much for everybody coming out here. I see people from the media, from the University of Manitoba, from the writing community, from Manitoba Writers Guild that I was with for quite some time, and the UFO fans. I mean, this is something that attracts so much attention. And one of the people I got to know a number of years ago was MJ Benias, who himself is a writer and historian and an educator. And he graciously accepted to write the foreword for my book. So thank you very much, MJ. I'd like to thank my publisher, August Night Press, John Beecher and Robbie Graham. I'd like to thank Deb and Elwyn Giesbrecht, who've supported me so much for this. My daughter and her husband for also tolerating it when Dad would go off on talking about UFOs all the time.
I wish he was my dad. We'd have long, wonderful conversations.
I'd also like to thank Ashley Kircher, who has helped me with data analysis and collection over the years. The Library and Archives Canada, who were very helpful in helping me get access to some documents. And I'd like to thank my wife, who has been very, very patient over the years for all the times that I literally have had calls in the middle of the night about UFOs. So she's tolerated that. And I really greatly appreciate it. Now, there's one person I really have to single out, though, and that is Member of Parliament Larry Maguire. He's a Member of Parliament for Brandon-Souris. And I had invited him to come here and make a statement. If those of you who don't know, Mr. Maguire made a formal statement publicly about a year ago now about how he's concerned about UAP, about unidentified aerial phenomena, and how the Canadian government should be taking it more seriously. And he's very concerned about incursions over Canadian military sites and nuclear sites and so forth. He was scheduled to come here. Unfortunately, Parliament starts next week, and he's burgeoned with all sorts of meetings right now and couldn't attend. But I invited him to, if he wanted to make a statement that we would read here. And what he provided was, I suppose, kind of a statement, but he gave a statement about the importance of UAP research, and particularly in relation to myself and my work with the Canadian government and UAP. So Hal, you have the thing in here. So this is by Larry Maguire, Member of Parliament for Brandon-Souris.
All right, here's what he wrote about Canada's UFO Declassified. After decades of little to no movement from governments on revealing what they know about unidentified aerial phenomena, or UAP, it looks like we are on the precipice of getting some answers. Who knows where all this is going, but Chris Rutkowski's book could not have come at a better time. For years, Rutkowski has meticulously cataloged official reports and compiled them for researchers, the media, and those wanting to learn more about Canadian UAP sightings. When the Department of National Defense was recently tasked with compiling a briefing for the minister, they went to Rutkowski. When I needed information on UAP sightings near Canadian nuclear facilities, I relied on his database and institutional knowledge. The interactions I had with a deputy minister at a parliamentary committee, armed with the information Rutkowski provided, led to the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission committing to cooperate with its American counterparts on UAP. That speaks volumes about Rutkowski's work, and his book reflects his steadfast commitment to documenting the best Canadian UAP reports and government documents that show how government departments and law enforcement have taken this issue a lot more seriously than some would think. Rutkowski has done a masterful job of using primary sources to tell the untold stories of UAP incidents that were reported to the RCMP, Department of National Defense, Transport Canada, and others. Reaching back into the archives, he weaves a compelling narrative about how everyday Canadians, military personnel, and civilian pilots have witnessed unexplained phenomena. For reasons unknown, our province of Manitoba has some of the most compelling UAP cases in Canada. Even the Canadian Mint produced a pure silver glow-in-the-dark coin of the famous Falcon Lake incident, which to this day is still unexplained. Even Luke Elizondo, who is helping spearhead the latest UAP efforts in the United States, commented to me about the numerous UAP sightings in our province, Manitoba. Rutkowski has selected one Manitoba incident that happened in 1969 that was reported by an off-duty RCMP officer while driving down a highway with his wife. They both witnessed a UAP for over 15 minutes and got within 50 to 100 feet of it. Then suddenly their windshield wipers stopped working, the headlights went out, and the engine stalled. All of this was reported to the National Research Council, and who knows if anyone ever truly investigated any available radar data or tried to corroborate the sighting with other witnesses. This is just one example of the many incidents that you could read about in Canada's UFO Declassified. You can dig into official government memos and letters which outline previous attempts to inquire and investigate what people had witnessed and could not easily explain why. For politicians and policymakers like myself who are just getting around to better understanding how the government of Canada documented and collected information in this this is a must-read book. As the stigma has started to recede, paving the way for academics, scientists, and everyday people to investigate this phenomenon, Rutkowski has given us a foundation to build from. This is not a new issue, but the seriousness of those in high places willing to openly talk about it is something we should all get used to. As we watch what's happening with UAP in Congress, at NASA, and with the courageous academics who are not afraid to go against the grain, Canada's UFO Declassified is another proof point that the phenomenon knows no borders or boundaries. There is a rich and deep historical record of incidents right here in Canada. If you are confounded by the phenomena and as curious as me, this book is for you. Larry Maguire, MP, Brandon-Souris. Pretty high praise for Chris. Yes. For a bit, I thought he was maybe your publicist, but obviously he's just a fan. And I'll just give you a bit of a tease. I don't know what point Chris is going to do this, but I heard Chris today talking to Kathy Kennedy on CJOB, and he said, I may have information tonight about a never before reported incident of late. Well, I just asked Chris about it because in radio, that's called a tease. You're always teasing people for what's coming. And Chris told me this literally came out last night from the government of Canada. So I'm excited to hear about this along with you. And this is rare. Chris says this only happens a couple of times a year where you'll get an official statement on a UAP like this. So I'm excited to hear about this. But let's get to my questions for Chris so that we can get to your questions for Chris. 10th book, I want to ask you this. How is this one different? Why is this one special?
Well, that's a very good question. This is the first book that is strictly about government documents. I relied a little bit on my own files. I've been involved in UFO investigations since the 1970s. Yes, I'm that old. I really am. But I've been investigating. I remember investigating the Carmen cases back in 1975. You know, it's interesting to hear the stories from people, and you know, it's part of who we are, because people tell these stories in family gatherings, at bars, or whatever. You know, these are where people talk about it. But this is a little different, because this book is about what the government was doing. And you know, recently we've heard awful lot about the American government. The Canadian government has been very much involved with UFO investigations. In fact, I started getting copies of reports from the Canadian government back in the 90s. And since then, I continually get reports. So it's interesting that most people aren't aware of the extent to which the Canadian government has been involved, whether it's the National Defense or Transport Canada or some other agency like the RCMP, but they've been taking it seriously. And as much as people like to make fun of this, and there's a stigma, as Larry mentions, it's being taken more and more seriously by more and more individuals, not just politicians, but scientists. There's a project now where scientists are going to go try and find whatever's in the bottom of the ocean that they think might be extraterrestrial and that type of thing. But there's a whole series of things that people aren't aware of, and much of it here in Canada. And we have a very good record, a consistent record from the 1940s right till now, which is what you don't have in the United States. Project Blue Book, that some people know about, was the American Air Force's investigation project. It stopped in 1969, and after that, we really have no idea exactly what was going on until recently, when it came out that there had been a project from 2007 to 2012 or something like that, and we're not sure what's happening after that. In fact, with all the hoopla that's coming out of the United States now, we still don't have any good details on what is being seen, you know, what the locations, the times, the dates, and you know, how things are described. We don't have any information, but in Canada, we do have that type of information.
And they can see, you know, if you have not seen the book yet, in the book, those documents are actually in this book, Chris, right? Which is also, I think, something sort of unusual and different.
Yeah, and I wanted to, again, because we always hear about stories and the tales are quite interesting, but the actual government documents are very interesting to see. And I reproduced, I think it's almost 50 government documents of cases and exchanges between the government officials and each other regarding things. There's one interesting document where in the book where the National Defense is debating whether they should tell CBC, there's CBC people here, whether they should tell CBC what's really going on. And they said, you know what, let's not tell CBC. We're not going to give them any information. So there's stuff like that in there. And these documents are in there. And it's quite interesting. And I wanted to share this with people who have this interest and they want to know what's going on.
I'm getting a little off track. I should have Chris tell us a bit more about him. And I promise we'll get to that, but I want to now follow up on that. So why in Canada is there more of a record of this compared to the States? Is it because they've maybe eliminated some of the documents down there? Why is there a better path here to the past when it comes to UFOs in Canada?
Well, that is a very good question. And I think the reason is the way that UFOs have been framed in Canada is a little bit different. Now, in the United States Air Force, as I mentioned, Project Blue Book, it was looked upon as a security issue, national defense, and
right.
you know, is it the Russians or some other country or whatever. And in Canada, Canada was sort of mimicking what was going on in the United States, but the twist was that the Royal Canadian Air Force, because in the United States they decided there really isn't anything worthwhile studying. That was what Project Blue Book decided. Yet the UFO reports still kept coming in. So the Canadian government said, well, what do we do with this UFO stuff? I mean, people are still reporting them. So it turns out that the National Research Council was tasked with investigating UFOs. And that's a scientific body. That was not the case in the United States.
Right.
So Canada's approach was through science.
And they maybe had it right first, right? I mean, now we're seeing that approach more in the US.
That's
Yeah.
a very good point. Yeah, because now there's this push for scientists to investigate UFOs. And Canada was doing that since about 1966, 67, something like that. And that had kept on going. Now, in 1995, the National Research Council itself got out of the UFO business for a number of reasons. And it was given back to another agency, Transport Canada and Nav Canada. Now, Transport Canada was looking at UFOs from the viewpoint of, well, it has something to do with aircraft or things in the sky, and pilots are seeing them. So let's record what's being recorded through Transport Canada, and also National Defense itself, because there were military pilots that were seeing things. So it went from defense to science to military and civilian, and then sort of into national defense again. And it seems like it's going back into civilian.
Interesting. So back to where I should have started. I explained my fascination from a little boy in southern Alberta with UFOs or UAP. Why has this interested you for so many years? Why have you written so many books about it? Why is Chris Rutkowski fascinated with UFOs?
Well, like yourself, when I was a kid, my parents plopped me in front of the TV and to watch the Mercury and Gemini launches way back on this, small little black and white screen, and you could kind of almost see what was going on. And then, in high school, the TV was rolled out, and we watched Neil Armstrong walk on the moon and all that sort of stuff. Mm-hmm. I do think he actually walked on the moon, by the way.
Yeah, me too.
It was sort of a gee whiz kind of thing. And in 1975, when I was finishing high school, there were a lot of UFOs that were being reported in Manitoba. And that was actually my introduction to media. I actually had my own TV show on video on cable TV in 1975.
Wow.
Talking about UFOs. I think we lasted a whole 5 episodes. I think at that time that was a record for video. It just seems fascinating. When I went into university, I was still interested. I went into astronomy, and my professors in astronomy were not that crazy about UFOs. They thought it was a waste of time, but the phone calls kept coming in from people who wanted to report something. So I said, I'll take the calls from you. I'm just a student. I'll take these calls from you. I wanted to get on their good side. So I did, because I took the calls and they didn't have to worry about the UFOs anymore. But I ended up hearing from so many people. I went into the countryside, the farmhouses and so forth, listening to people tell me their stories, and just the action of listening to people tell their stories was reassuring for them. And for me, it was very fascinating, because as a scientist, these things shouldn't exist at all, but what are people seeing? Mm. So I was intrigued. And after about a year and a half, my professor came to me and said, we've got an opening for the weekly physics colloquium seminar. And it's usually done by professors talking about the latest discoveries in quantum mechanics or something. And somebody got sick, they didn't want to do it. Do you want to talk about UFOs? So I said, sure, I could talk about what I've heard. So for an undergraduate to talk at a university level about UFOs to a physics seminar is actually fairly unique. And I was scheduled to go into the conference room to talk, but a little while before that, they had put out a notice that Chris Rutkowski was talking, and my professor came to me and said, we have to move you out of the conference room. We have to move you into the largest lecture hall on campus, because word got around that you're talking about UFOs. And it was my baptism by fire, because 500 people came out to hear me lecture in the Arms Lecture Hall at the University of Manitoba about UFOs, and the TV cameras were there, and it was something. And that made me think about, well, what am I going to do with all this information? And somebody said, why don't you write a book? And that's where it started.
And that's where it began. And here we are 10 books later. Isn't that cool? So you mentioned, and Larry mentioned in the letter that I read about, it seems like Manitoba has a lot of sightings. Any theories on why that is? Why do we have so many UFO or UAP sightings here?
Well, it's.
Or is that even true?
Well, it seems like it. I'll go with the seems
Yeah.
like it. As some of you know, every year I put out something called the Canadian UFO Survey, where we gather all the reports that are filed every year, and we find out how many are in Saskatchewan, how many in Ontario, how many in Manitoba. And it turns out it's related to population, so that if there's more population in a certain area, you'll get more reports. Sort of, that's
Sure,
the relationship.
makes sense. Yeah.
So technically, there's more reports in Ontario and BC, but statistically, there's actually more per capita in the Maritimes than anywhere else in Canada. Why that is, I don't know. Manitoba holds its own. We may seem like we have more because a lot of the cases here in Manitoba have got a lot more attention. We've had the Falcon Lake case. There have been a few cases that we've had Carmen, the Charlie Red Star,
Right.
Had, a lot of those things. So it seems as though Manitoba has had more. And some of those cases are really quite fascinating and are very significant and have been taken seriously and investigated by the officials.
Yeah, we are. I mean, you've got a crowd here tonight. We're on YouTube. People are interested in UFOs or UAP. You talked about, the 500 people showing up at your lecture, and so we know people are interested in this, as you and I are, Chris. Why should we be interested? Why should we care about this?
Yeah, why should you read a book about UFOs? And the reason is, first of all, 10% of the Canadian population believe they've seen UFOs. So if you've seen a UFO, you're in good company. Secondly, the demographic shows that the UFOs are seen by people in all walks of life, coast to coast to coast. It's becoming more apparent that there's something going on when you have pilots reporting UFOs. If a pilot sees a UFO, and we do get reports like that, Transport Canada registers a number of UFO reports every year, and I think there's something like 500 reports in Transport Canada over the past 15 years alone, mostly from pilots. And you think, okay, if pilots are seeing UFOs and let's say they're imagining it, well, that should be a concern to people. Or let's say the pilot says there's something on radar and air traffic control says, no, there isn't, that should be concerned. Or the other way around, and there's nothing there, and air traffic control says, no, there's something right next to your plane. That should be a concern if it's a problem with the technology. And as Larry Maguire says, there's some issue regarding incursions in Canadian airspace. Usually when another country flies into our airspace, planes are sent out to scramble right away. There's a lot of cases where that doesn't happen with regard to UFOs and UAP. We wonder what's going on, and it's affecting us more and more. And so from a security standpoint, a safety standpoint, a scientific curiosity standpoint, because is it possible that there's something really going on that we don't know? And I haven't even mentioned the alien thing yet, but that's a possibility. My astronomy background says there's probably life out there somewhere. Can it travel here between the stars? Maybe by bending the laws of physics as we know it, not breaking them, but bending them, which, and if a star out there has a jump on our sun by, a little bit, not 100 years, but let's say 1,000,000 years, a planet around that star might have a civilization that's a bit more advanced than us, and maybe they know how to travel around the universe a little bit more. So there's so many interesting questions and possibilities, and it would be, it seems narrow-minded for us to not pay attention to this, especially when every year in Canada we have something like 750 to 1,000 UFO reports recorded. That's just Canada. The United States has a factor of at least 10 every year. And in Canada alone, the Canadian UFO Survey is now at something like 25,000 separate UFO reports just over the past 30 years.
This is what I personally love about Chris Rutkowski. he just walked us through, like, you know, you mentioned a conspiracy theory, you know, have we been to the moon? I probably don't believe most of these conspiracy theories, but I enjoy discussing them and talking. And Chris just walked us through all the possibilities that may be causing us to see UFOs and these things that we don't know what they are. And I think that's that's your science background, right?
That's my science, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I am a science writer. That's what my profession is. I like to deal with scientific topics and sort of boil them down into a way that makes sense to people. I mean, just over the past couple of weeks, I was going through some PhD theses that had been written by experts on sea ice and trying to make the point about that they're researching, and people are doing research on permafrost and the reason why the railroad line to Churchill is having so many problems, and how can we make that more stable. I mean, turning that science into a way that makes sense to people from so many different aspects is really critical. So being able, to convey to the public the importance of science, especially a mystery, something that could be and could not be in terms of UFOs. I think it's very important for us to grasp some of the gravity part of the fun.
Back to very good. Back to the letter from Larry Maguire, MP at Brandon-Souris. He says, it looks like we are on the precipice of getting some answers. Are we?
Well, I hope so. In the United States, for example, they're pushing for congressional hearings into UFOs. There's a lot of American politicians who are working towards that. Some that are coming forth, and they probably have seen lots of YouTube videos recently from that. There seems to be a lot of pressure in the political arena for that. And my concern is, be careful what you wish for, because Gerald Ford, previous American president by a few, when he was a congressman in 1966, lobbied for congressional hearings in the United States about UFOs. He thought there should be congressional hearings. He was successful, and there were congressional hearings in the United States on UFOs already in 1968. It already happened. There were scientists in Congress talking about UFOs, debating them, talking about all sorts of aspects. And then a year later, Project Blue Book died. So the United States Air Force decided, that's it, we don't want to hear anything more about it. So congressional hearings may not necessarily be the end all for this, but at least the discussion is going forward. And I think that's a very positive thing.
Yeah. We're going to get to your questions here in about 5 or 10 minutes, but I mean, those are the questions I wanted to ask, Chris. Is there anything else? I want to get back to the book, because this is your latest book, your 10th book. What else do we need to know about this book? People are going to get it autographed tonight. They're going to buy it tonight. I'm sure it's going to be another really good seller, as your books have been. What else do we need to know about the book? Because that's why we're here tonight.
Well, if you have that kitchen table that is a wobbly leg, it's just right.
Right. Yes.
But no, I have this is chock full of actual UFO reports investigated by the government in some way. And by the government, I mean RCMP, Royal Canadian Air Force, and after that, the Canadian Forces National Defense. It only covers up to about 1970-ish, I think that the last case is 1980 as well. After that point, things changed in the government. And can I say that I'm working on another book?
Yes,
okay.
You can. I don't think your wife
My
wants
wife
to hear
doesn't
that.
know that yet. So
Yes, you can.
I don't even see her now anymore, so it's fine. But what I'm going to do is I'm just going to read a little bit.
Yeah, please.
It's okay. And just to show you the diversity of some of these cases. And these are so the book is about older cases, but they have perspective on what's happening now. This goes back to 1960, as a matter of fact. July of 1960, up at a place called Clan Lake in the Northwest Territories. That evening at about 6:00 p.m., a prospector named John Person had been dropped by his seaplane at Clan Lake to set up camp in preparation for his work and getting the camp ready for his partner who was coming later. After about 20 minutes, he heard a noise like another aircraft approaching and looked up to see if he could see it, but there was nothing visible. The noise kept getting louder and he periodically looked up and was unable to locate the source of the sound. Finally, he heard something hit the water behind him, and when he turned around, and this is the quote, "I saw a splash and what appeared to be some object with arms or spokes rotating in the water. The object was rotating very rapidly and throwing water. Gradually, the object seemed to spin less and finally stopped. After the object stopped, there was a backwash which came over to where I was. This would be about 1,700 feet from where the object landed. The object I saw in motion in the water appeared to be about 4 to 6 feet wide. I could not see any color because of the flying water. I didn't see any steam when the object hit the water." Now this is, just imagine, he's in this remote area, he hears a noise, something hits the water behind him, and as it's hitting the water, he turns in, he sees this thing spinning and spinning and spinning and slows down and eventually settles underneath the water. That actually started an RCMP investigation that went out to the site and tried to find whatever it was that crashed underneath into the water. You heard of Roswell? Well, this is sort of a Canada Roswell that you have never heard of before.
And listen, we want you to buy the book, right? Obviously, that's why we're here. But any conclusions drawn? I mean, you hear that story, and then did RCMP make any conclusions about the sighting?
RCMP did not make any conclusion. I don't want to give the whole thing away.
Yeah,
but they didn't make any conclusion, but they called in the National Research Council, the experts on astronomy, to come in and try and figure out, was it a meteorite? Was it something astronomical? So the National Research Council, Hertzberg Institute of Astrophysics, sent their expert, and he himself was a little baffled by what happened. Now, there are a number of other cases. I'm going to just mention a few things. One interesting thing in the book is I have all 28 pages of a special briefing that was given to the person who was the sort of in charge of helping the Minister of Defense at the time, who was Leo Cadieux. He came into office in 1967, and because there were some UFOs being reported, he asked for a briefing. And we have that entire briefing. You heard about the briefing that was done recently in Canada. Well, this is one from 1967. And I noted on page 12 of the briefing was the beginning of the most interesting part of the document. He noted that 29 or 32 cases in 1967 were either Class A or Class B in the National Defense class that was really interesting or semi-interesting. 6 were worthy of discussion in the briefing. The first was the Falcon Lake case, which some of you know about. Soil samples were analyzed and so forth. And here was the kicker, and this is actually in this briefing. Neither the DND nor the RCMP investigation teams were able to provide evidence which could dispute Mr. Mihalik's story, as the fellow saw it. Although the investigation has been completed, a satisfactory explanation or conclusion is still lacking. So this statement was actually in the briefing given to the Minister of National Defense at the time, that they couldn't explain it. And there were 6 cases like that, only one of which was the Falcon Lake case, which some of you have heard. And there's 5 others which are just as interesting, just as well documented. Now, as I mentioned, these are fairly old cases. But, and as we tease,
oh yeah, here we go.
This is
the most recent.
This is the teaser. So I mentioned that Transport Canada still accepts UFO reports from pilots. The pilots are still reporting things to Transport Canada, and they're actually called UFOs according to Transport Canada. In Canada, we call them UFOs. None of this,
good, I like that better.
None of this UAP nonsense.
I like it better.
UFOs. And so there's actually a category in the incident report that pilots file. And pilots file things, if a bird hits the window, if a tire gets blown, or they go off course or something like that. They file incident reports. And one of the categories is actually called weather balloon, meteor, rocket, UFO. And every year, as I mentioned, there's something like 500 from Transport Canada over the past 15 years or so. Very once in a while, most of them are like balloons and fireworks and things like that. But once in a while, there are ones that are UFOs, definitely UFOs. And happened that last night, about 9 or 10 o'clock, I checked my phone, and sure enough, I got a report, Transport Canada.
They're working with you. They're helping you sell the book.
They are. And this is actually what it was. Incident, August 19th, 2022, 15:18 Zulu, which is universal time, sort of British time. So something like 10 o'clock in the morning. And this happened in the vicinity of Saint Stanislaus, Quebec. I have no idea where that is. But this is what they have. And this is from the actual report. A series of 17 orange circular objects at an altitude of approximately 6,000 to 10,000 feet were observed at the height of Lac Saint-François near Saint Stanislaus. Size of a jet, equidistant, easterly direction, silent. The Quebec Royal Canadian Mounted Police unit in Montreal was notified. This is an actual UFO report from Transport Canada that is just now being made public to you. You've all signed your NDAs, so you're fine. They passed that.
I think that was passed around, yes, Chris, yes.
So, but reported by NAV Canada, which is the organization that keeps track of all the flights in Canada. And it just shows you that, you know, the book is about the old stuff, but there's so many that are exactly like this, and it's ongoing. And so back in the, in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, the Canadian government, the RCAF, Transport Canada, and so forth, RCMP were investigating UFOs, and to this day, we're still getting the UFOs through official channels.
And quickly, before we get to your questions, and that's next, I promise you, but I have a question about this. Why does a sighting, how does a sighting get to a level where it's an official release like that, if it's only happening a couple times, if it's a rare occurrence?
Well, these incident reports, there's about 50 to 100 a day, actually, believe it or not.
Okay.
And there's things like, if somebody's pointing a laser,
Yeah,
never do
but
that.
for it to be a UFO, that's okay.
Yeah, for it to be an actual UFO, those are still occurring, but much rarer.
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah.
Excellent. Chris Rutkowski, ladies and gentlemen. We're giving you an opportunity to get the book signed by Chris, and we are now going to ask you some questions. All right, so this is your chance.
There's Johnny, he's at the ready.
John's got the microphone. John's going to come around, get your question, and John's going to ask the question.
Absolutely. So just tell it to me and then I'll repeat it back in the microphone. Are there any questions in the room?
There we go.
I'm Shayla Elizabeth, and Maureen, the librarian at the Winnipeg Library, she was telling me pre-pandemic there were new databases, and one of them was about unpublished PhD theses, and one of the streams was UFOs. I'm just wondering if you came across that.
So this is a question about unpublished PhD theses that were discovered by a librarian at the university, and was just hoping that Chris could comment on that.
Well, Sheila, thank you very much for the question. Every year, there are, I'm guessing, something like 25 to 50 doctoral and master's theses published on the subject of UFOs. Every year. You hear the scientists aren't interested in UFOs, they're only starting to get interested in UFOs. No, there has been scientific interest all along. Now, as for these unpublished theses, there certainly will be many that we don't have access to. It wouldn't surprise me in the least. There was an excellent doctoral thesis by a fellow named Matthew Hayes, which I think he was from Trent University. And actually his topic of the thesis was on the National Research Council UFO files, but the content of the files in terms of what the National Research Council was corresponding with people about regarding UFOs, not necessarily the UFO cases themselves. But that's just one that I know of over the past year or two. So yeah, there's absolutely lots of interesting things, and it's worthwhile. I think that the subject is is rife for people to dive in for a master's and doctoral theses.
Yeah. Thanks for the question. Anybody else?
Well, there is a question online.
Okay, great.
Somebody was just asking, they had heard that the federal government had recently amended your UFO data contract recently and was wondering what this indicated regarding the government's perspective on and approach to UFOs and which federal body is continuing this work, if any.
Amended my UFO contract. I've actually never had a UFO contract with the government. The government has been providing me with copies of UFO reports and sending me data on information about UFO reports since about the year 2000, maybe 2001. And what's happened is that over the past year, I've gotten fewer and fewer over the past since the beginning of the pandemic. And so I haven't got very many over the past year. I don't know whether that means that the government's terminated it because I never actually had a contract. It's sort of been a handshake.
Maybe it's pandemic related.
Maybe
right?
pandemic
Yeah.
related, but then, you know,
Right.
I just got this one, so license renewed. James Bond.
Anybody?
Yes.
Another question? Yeah, there's one.
I heard a little, or read a little while ago that the Americans had actually called me at one point that they had a chat with me. I was wondering if that was true and what the nature of that chat might have been.
So this is a question about the American government potentially calling in Chris to have a chat with him and wondering if you could elaborate on the content of that chat.
Well, it's not quite correct in that Larry Maguire, the member of parliament here in Canada, he actually asked me to give him a briefing. So I gave him a briefing on what's been going on with UFOs. And just after that, he invited some of the Americans, Louis Elizondo and Hal Puthoff and people like that to give him a briefing as well. And there's an organization called the Scientific Coalition for Ufology. They were asked, they're based in the United States. They were also invited by Larry to give a briefing, excuse me. So there's been there's sort of interest from a number of people and a number of organizations. So when the Elizondo and the Scientific Coalition of Ufology, went public with the fact that they had consulted with Larry Maguire, my name was associated with it because I was involved in that as well. Now, I also am a member of the Scientific Coalition for Ufology, which is the American group. And they call upon me from time to time to give advice on things as well. So I don't know if that qualifies as the Americans seeking my help or not.
So it wouldn't have a government or.
Not at a government level, but anytime they want to call.
So Robbie online asks, first of all, he offers thanks and says, if forced to step out of your admirably objective stance within the UFO field, what is your personal opinion on the true nature of the Falcon Lake incident? Did a physical craft really land that day?
Good question.
That's a good question.
Good question.
So I'm not going to recap the whole Falcon Lake thing. You'd read one of my previous books about that.
Is that all your book, Chris, is selling
available
books?
at But the object that was seen by Mr. Mahalik out there, and that he physically was burned by, I happen to know the Mahalik family. I grew up on the same street, and I used to hang out with his son. In fact, his son was the co-author of the Falcon Lake book. And the family was very shy of media. They didn't want to talk too much to media because they didn't want to get ridiculed or whatever. And so when Unsolved Mysteries, remember that show, Unsolved Mysteries? Yeah. They flew me and the Mahalik family down to their set for NBC's segment on it. And I've known them for quite a long time. I don't think this fellow would make up stuff. As a matter of fact, he went down to the Mayo Clinic for a complete physical and was examined by a psychiatrist. The Mayo Clinic psychiatrist said, Mr. Mahalik doesn't make up stuff. He's not the type of guy to make up stories. And I know them for quite some time. I don't think he made up the story either, but that leaves the question, well, what happened?
Right.
And if it wasn't a secret American flying thing, and he actually never talked in terms of aliens, he thought it was a something from the Apollo program. As a matter of fact, Apollo 1, the terrible tragedy of Apollo 1, I don't know if it was even called Apollo 1 back then when the astronauts died. That was all in the news, but that was part of the space program to the moon. So that happened just before then. So he thought maybe that's what this thing was. It was the space thing that went off course and landed. And he never thought in terms of aliens. But if it wasn't an American secret craft, and not a Russian craft or some other country, what was it? Because we don't think he made it up. In fact, there's a lot of evidence that suggests that he didn't make up the story, that something really happened to him. If it wasn't that, and it wasn't this, and it wasn't this other thing, what was it? And I have to sit on the fence. It's very pointy, one of those picket fences. Hurts, oh, yeah. But, it's still a scientific viewpoint to say we don't know. The same thing is what National Defense and the RCMP said. Right. We don't have an explanation. And you have to leave it there because there's no proof it was an alien spaceship either.
And I think that's fair, right? To say we don't know, right? But something happened.
Something happened, absolutely.
Yeah, for sure. Another question? Anybody?
Oh, we have a question online.
Oh boy.
So Rick asks, how do we move from a recounting of the various sightings to an understanding of what the phenomenon actually is?
Well, we've got a couple of hours to go. So.
Yeah.
And you know what? That is the fundamental issue where ufology is at now. Where do you go from here? You have reports, you have government investigations. And as I said at the beginning, this isn't just stories. These are actual documents, reports, people, reported them to the RCMP, to the National Defense, investigated by, military personnel. So it's gone beyond just stories. And if you're taking it seriously and something's happening, where do you go from here? Do you, use a analysis to crunch the data? And my colleague Jeff Dittman, who co-authored some books with me as well, he's my stats guy. He's done that as well. And you can move forward with data crunching, but the people still want to be satisfied with some answers. We don't have the answers, but the pursuit, if more scientists get on board, there's some positive things with this Project Galileo that a fellow from Harvard's spearheading. If more scientists get on board, if they accept more data from the Canadian UFO survey, 25,000 cases, you can use that in some statistical analysis. Mm-hmm. I think we can move forward in a way that doesn't reject what we've heard and doesn't make fun of everything, but at the same time, understanding this is a human phenomenon that affects so many people and move forward in that direction.
Yeah. Well, listen, I'll just throw this in. This is my thought on this. You said careful what you wish for. This is much more fun. Right? I mean, we all want answers, but careful what you wish for, and I certainly enjoy discussing theories more and having Chris on my radio show when I had my radio show. And after this, we'll have conversations. And many of you, I'm sure, have had experiences similar to what Chris has been talking about. And so that's my enjoyment in this and other conspiracy theories or, theories about things that are unusual and unexplained. But anyhow, that's my 2 cents. I think this is more enjoyable. It's more fun to gather and talk like this.
And I just want to point out, even though we have 25,000 reports in Canada over the past 20 years or so, 30 years or so, that doesn't mean there's 25,000 reports of alien spaceships.
Right.
The vast majority of UFO reports that are filed do have explanations. In fact, just over the past month, we had 20 or 30 reports of beautiful strings of pearls in the sky, cigar-shaped objects glowing, moving slowly and ponderously. That was the Starlink satellites. And so most UFOs do have explanations, but it's that percentage every year, whether it's 1%, 2%. And when you're talking 25,000, even a small percentage means there's some out there that are worth looking at. And even in my book, I call a spade a spade. There's some classic cases in Canadian UFO history that I said, you know what? I think this has an explanation. And I'm going to do that because we have to accept the reality that if you're approaching something from a scientific point of view and you're searching for answers, you have to make sure you're getting good answers, not just waving arms and saying, yes, everything is real. No, you have to look at what's really going on.
Yeah. I think we have time for one or two more questions, right?
Absolutely. So we can take one of those two questions from over there, and then we have, or actually, let's do those two questions, and then we have one from Stephen.
Sure.
Hi, I'm just wondering about, I did see on Google, Project Blue Book finished in 1969. But I saw on Google that it resumed in like 2009 with the US government.
So this is a question about the potential resumption
It's
of.
not called Project Blue Book, it's called something else, but they're still investigating. Well, I don't know if they're still doing that, but.
So this is a question about the potential resumption of Project Blue Book, perhaps under a different name in the year 2009. I wonder if you could comment on this.
Sure. Yeah, there's no question Project Blue Book finished in 1969, actually technically March of 1970. But after that point, very recently, we found out that there had been a government project between 2007 and 2012. And whether it was whatever name it was under, but we're not sure if it was the same approach. Project Blue Book involved all of the United States Air Force military bases. We're not even sure if this project, which was run by only one person or a few people, we don't know if was the same thing. So we're not sure what was done, but we suspect the United States government was still investigating, but we don't have that information.
Sorry, I just want to ask also, would it be good for Canadian government to start like a Project Blue Book with our scientists, like go over all the stuff and start a new project?
And so this was a question about whether or not it makes sense for the government to start something similar in that regard.
I think the Canadian government should. I mean, we're already partnered with NORAD, with the United States government. So there's kind of something like that going on already. But I think the Canadian government should invest some resources into investigating UFOs. There's no question.
And I have one too about like, has there ever been or will there ever be a UFO conference in Winnipeg?
You know what? That's a great, sorry, I'm interrupting because that's a great question. And I have said this for a long, do you mind, John, if I jump in? So her question is, has there ever been or will there ever be a UFO conference in Winnipeg? I want tickets.
You missed it. There actually have been two. The Manitoba Conference on Ufology. They were one was in the 1980s, the other one was in the 1990s. And there actually was sort of a mini UFO conference in conjunction with the Winnipeg Science Fiction Society conference. The first one, before KeyCon, there was something called UNCON, and there was sort of a UFO conference associated with that back in the 1970s. But in terms of a full-blown UFO conference, it would be interesting to get. I've been to a few. I've spoken at a number in the United States, so it'd be interesting to see.
Really good question. We have time for one final online question, correct?
That's exactly it. So after this question, I'll turn things over to you folks if you have any closing comments, and then go over the thrilling signing procedural announcement that you're promising. But Stephen asks, how do you report and track UFO sightings in Manitoba if you are so inclined?
Well, I'm inclined. People report UFOs to me. I mean, it used to be that people would send letters, send phone calls to me, and that type of thing. Recently, we get UFO reports via email, on Facebook. There's a number of Facebook groups that I am involved with. Twitter, we get tweets that are UFO reports. I've got UFO reports on LinkedIn. I mean, social media is remarkable in that matter. So, it's very easy to get UFO reports. There actually are a couple of websites online where you can report your UFO reports and gets into the Canadian UFO survey. So there are ways of getting it. And I have to say, the only way for us to understand what's going on is to get the UFO reports. You need the data. The scientists want the data. Let's get the data. And without the UFO reports, all the speculation about whether the aliens are green, purple, or polka dot, or their ships are a mile wide or smaller than a dime, it's irrelevant if we don't actually have the data, the investigation, and the reports.
Chris Rutkowski, the book is Canada's UFOs Declassified. Get your copy here at McNally Robinson. Thank you for coming. Chris is going to sign. Chris, you want to say anything before we get you signed?
Thank you so much for coming out, for everybody who's supporting me in the writing over the years, from all the aspects, from the astronomers to the IT people and everybody, and to my family and friends. Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you both. It's always such a pleasure to launch a book here for Chris at the store, and always a very mind-expanding experience in a variety of ways. So thank you all for your attention and for your questions, both here and online. As mentioned, we're going to move Chris along to a table, which is just beside the cash desk, and he'll be signing copies of his new book there. We have copies of the book on display at the store. We have copies behind our cash desk, copies at the signing table. Feel free to get a book signed before you pay for it. Please pay for the book before you leave. Other than that, I just want to thank again August Night Press for publishing this book in the first place, all of you for joining us, and just ask you one final time in thanking Hal Anderson and Chris Rutkowski.